changing climate. And Al's a master gardener and retired forester and currently a major trail builder. He's been building trails all over the area lately, working with the Land Trust. He spent 37-year career with the Forest Service and BLM, Bureau of Land Management. Worked all over the Western United States, worked in Alaska, Washington, D.C. He spent over 20 years with the National Fire Overhead Teams. And while he was with BLM, he was at the National Interagency Fire Center, providing technical and financial assistance to local communities. He's received multiple national awards for his leadership in agency fire management. We're really honored to have him. One of his passions is assisting communities and reducing losses from wildfire lands. And he's literally written the book, and I would try to show it, but I don't think it'll really show up. But he's literally written the book, Fire Resistant Plants for Eastern Washington, which is available through the Master Gardener program. So thrilled to have Al back, and I'll get my screen off of here and let you jump in here, Al.
Okay, as soon as you're done sharing, I'll share.
All righty. It's all yours. And again, always put your questions, you can throw them in the chat. We'll keep track of those. So.
Yeah, that's thank you, Kirk. I appreciate the introduction. Is what I was going to do here was if you do have questions, like Kirk said, put them down in the chat and we'll talk about them. We got about 2 or 3 breaks in this presentation, so just go ahead and put them down. So what I want to talk about tonight is fire resistant landscaping in a climate changing environment. And some of the advantages of that are, as you can read, I don't want to read all these slides to you because I know you people can read better than I can. But the idea is to save water, save homes, and reduce maintenance. Create an environment around your home that I hope you're comfortable with and love. One of the things that I found over the years, when a fire comes in and threatens a community, people get all excited and do stuff, and they do it out of fear. A fear of losing their home. And then as soon as the fear is gone, they stop doing the maintenance. They stop doing the stuff. Because I tell you what, fear is not a motivator. Fear is a reaction to a stimulus, if you will. And once that fear is gone, your desire to do something goes away also. So that's why I'm talking about build an environment around your home that you like, that you love, and really want to take care of. So with that, we'll talk about, so the purpose of this is just to share information on plant selection of fire-resistant vegetation. That's the whole intent. You can read the slide there. Now, what I'm going to do as we go through this is, you've heard this connect the dots, right? You got to connect the dots. But before you can connect the dots, we got to have a lot of dots out there so that we can connect. And so what I'm going to do here this evening is I'm going to talk about things, if you will, kind of independently, and then hope they all come together at the end. So we will have connected the dots, but you need the dots there first before you can connect them. So we'll start off with getting the idea that climate change, it is real, it's here. I hope everybody pretty much recognizes that. We have like 98% of all scientists have, pretty much agree on that. And there's a few outliers, like in everything, but it's amazing that, we have learned a lot of things over the years. One of the things that I thought was very interesting, and I'll just kind of go off course here just a little bit on one of my first slides, is that there was a serious program and scheme put together by some very influential people, and they published magazine articles in 38 different popular magazines saying that climate change is a hoax, okay? And they were very popular. And that really got a lot of people going in that direction. But yet there hasn't been any scientific articles that say contrary to that. They all say, all the scientific articles, which most of us don't read, but we read the popular magazines. So that's why I think the controversy got started quite a few years ago. So we want to talk about weather versus climate. Weather is, I hope everybody knows, is it changes daily. It just what, 2 days ago we had 77-degree weather, I believe it was in Wenatchee, and today it was, I don't think it got much above 30. But that's just the daily change. Climate, on the other hand, is a thing that takes decades, if not centuries, to change. Okay, but now, as a result of some of our, human actions, it's changing very rapidly. And I think we just need to be alert to that. I think most people are very much attuned to the idea that the climate is changing, but yet many of us don't want to do much about it, or jump into it. Um, Here's the other thing that I'm not sure most of us recognize. Climate change is talking about what it will result in is extremes in conditions, extremes in weather, or excuse me, temperature from one end to the other. For example, we may get an average, a temperature of as low as 40 degrees, and then a couple of days later, it may be 120 degrees. But yet the average is still going to be around 80, right? If you add the 40 and 120 together, it's still an 80-degree average. So our averages may not change a whole lot, but what's going to change a bunch is those extremes. If you will, the standard deviation is going to go way outside the normal range of variability. So we're going to see drastic changes and swings from one side to the other side in temperatures, precipitation, and in storms. As the lots of different things, carbon dioxide, methane, and moisture in the air, they hold the heat in from the sun. And what that does, that warms up the atmosphere quite a bit. So heat is a form of energy, right? And so what happens, we get this tremendous amount of heat in certain areas of the atmosphere, and it's going to create higher highs, lower lows. And so we're going to get extremes in temperature, and things are going to move very rapidly from one side and one condition to the other condition. As you know, how often do you see extremes in temperature? What was 70 degrees in January in Billings, Montana? It would be much closer to a normal, if you will, of 70 below. And so we're seeing these extremes all across the world, but definitely across the United States. Look at the type of conditions that happened in the Northeast this winter. We went from 1 week where it was in the 70s, and the next week it was down in the freezings and storms coming in. So we're going to see extremes in temperatures and weather conditions. Now, if I knew the answer to this question, what is the correct plant to have, then I'd be absolutely great. But you know what? We can talk about some attributes of plants, and that's what we're going to talk about. And we'll talk about some specific plants as we go through here. But plants that have a wide range of variability, that they can deal with a lot of different climatic and weather conditions. And generally, in this area, we're going to be talking those that have xeric characteristic, has low water requirements. So those are the types of things that we'll be looking for. And we'll talk about some of the attributes of those plants as we move through here. So the plants that we want to be looking at are those that are adaptive to changing conditions. And this reminds me of something that General Eisenhower during World War II made a statement when he was planning the invasion at Normandy and what have you. He said, anybody that attempts to implement a big project or any kind of project without planning is a fool. He says, anybody that ever tries to implement a plan is a fool. You need to be adaptive, and you need to be able to readily change. You set a plan on a piece of paper, but then as the things start to unfold and unroll, don't stick to the plan as you had, but be adaptive to it, and if you will, adaptive management, if you will, of your vegetation. So now I want to shift to another dot, if you will. I want to talk about some terms, some definitions. A native plant, it's a plant that's been in the area for a long time, centuries and millennia, if you will. And another term that we often use is indigenous plants, that they've been here for a long time. So they're used to the types of environments that they're found in. Another plant another definition is naturalized plants. Those are exotic plants that people brought in from elsewhere. In fact, here's a quiz question. What was the first naturalized plant in the United States, or in North America, I should say? It was the dandelion. Okay, the Pilgrims brought it over with them because they were not sure. They brought it from Holland. That's where the Pilgrims came from. They brought it from Holland, and they brought it over because they weren't sure there was going to be green plants here that they could eat with. Dandelion is edible, so that's why they brought it with them. And by gosh, it is, in case you didn't know, it's done well. That's a joke. So anyway, another thing, xeric or xeriscape, it's those plants or landscapes that require very little water. And when we talk about planting xeric plants in our yard or around our home, they do need help getting started. They need a year or two of water to make sure that we get them started. We're starting from young critters, if you will. Another term that I think is important, biodiversity. That is the variety of different living organisms that we have within an ecosystem. And the reason that's important is the more we get into extremes in climate and what have you, the biodiversity has become more and more important. There's a term called dynamic equilibrium. When one thing goes high, something else goes low, and it kind of just moves up and down, if you will. And so the greater biodiversity we have, the more stable our ecosystem, and whether that be they're all living ecosystem, a human ecosystem or a wild ecosystem. So we need to have greater biodiversity to make sure that we can stand the extremes from one and back and forth. I hope that makes sense. Now I want to throw a couple of terms out, some fire terms, if you will. Is fire resistant. And that's the term that we want to use when we're talking about vegetation around a home. By and large, it's the ability of a plant to withstand and stay non-ignited, if you will. And there's characteristics that they don't burn as easily as other plants. And so all plants will burn eventually given enough heat. So there's nothing that's fireproof, but there are those plants that take more energy to ignite than others. So if we can reduce actually, I should say that, let me rephrase that. If we can increase the amount of energy that's needed for a plant to burn, the safer we are with that, okay? Now, the other three terms there is fire, whoops, whoa, touch too much. Is the other three terms are more tied to a natural environment, such as around here. Fire resistant is how well the plant does and recovers from a fire, some type of disturbance, if you will. And these terms are all, if you notice, they all have different meanings, and I hear them get thrown around a lot, and sometimes they're used very not exactly correct. Some people think we should have fire resistant plants in our yard. Well, I think we should have fire resistant plants in our yard, but not fire resilient plants necessarily. Okay. And fire tolerant is, you can read that, is they can withstand a lot of heat. Fire adapted, take an aspen stand, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into trees, but it depends on fire, okay? And it's adapted so that it reproduces and lives for a period of time with fire. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit about shrub steppe ecosystem. I hope everybody knows that a shrub is a woody plant with lots of stems, several stems arising from the ground. Opposite of a tree is a tree has one stem coming up, and that's it. So that's the difference between. In fact, sometimes we can grow a shrub similar to a tree by managing the number of stems that come up. And I think some of us have done that to manage. So we put all the energy in a central stem, but it's still a shrub, but we can try to grow it like a small tree. A steppe is a large area of grass, if you will, with pretty much devoid of trees and very few trees, but generally in the riparians, and lots of different wildflowers and grasses around. Okay, and we have lots of that. So, excuse me. Geology and geography of North Central Washington. I want to talk about this a little bit. Is that we've got three basic biomes, living areas, three different ecosystems, if you will. And those being the mixed conifer, which basically starts way up at the crest of the Cascades and comes down to maybe 2,000 to 3,000 feet, depending on the area. And then that's the mixed forest with Douglas fir and true firs and those different types of species. Then we get down lower, maybe around 2,000 feet roughly. We get into the dry forest, which is primarily ponderosa pine. I should say was primarily ponderosa pine. And after a lot of years of harvesting trees, now it's pretty much changed to a lot of Douglas fir has come in underneath those as a successional species. And then we get down lower, down to the Wenatchee area and out into the Douglas County area. We're into the sage steppe area. And those are the three primary ecosystems or biomes, if you will, that we have in this area. I keep touching this and it's too sensitive. My mouse is, okay, we got there. Okay, now I want to present something here that I bet you most of you have never really given a lot of thought to, but it's in my opinion, it's a very important concept to keep in mind. If you look at that geography, geology, climate, soils, is everything in our area, in the world, as a matter of fact, is based on the geology of the area. If you will, the plate tectonics, the moving of continents around, floating around on the mantle, floating around on the crust floating around on the mantle of the earth. And where they end up is the geography, right? In close to the ocean, out in the desert, what have you. Well, those two things together have in the past always created the climate. And the climate and geography and geology have created the soil. So this is a tearing down, if you will, that everything is kind of related, if you will. The soils determine what kind of plants we have. The plants determine what kind of animals live in the area. So if you think about this, it's a nice little tidy thing that everything is interconnected. The geology, geography brings it right down to what the plants that grow in the area. Now, one of the things that we have been doing lately is we're changing some of that stuff as far as the climate is concerned. The geology and geography are staying the same, but some of the effects that's happening in the atmosphere is changing, which in turn changes our climate, which is going to eventually change the soils and et cetera, the plants. So now let's talk about those systems, those ecosystems we have. The shrub steppe, the primary vegetation that we find out there, the sagebrush, bitterbrush, and probably rabbit brush. We got a lot of that out in our country, and it's probably the most predominant in the Great Basin, the Columbia Basin area. Now, I throw another term out here. There's not a distinct line between every ecosystem. We don't move just from the shrub steppe into the dry forest. There's the edge of that, which can move back and forth, is called an ecotone. It's the area where it's not one, but it's not the other. It's a combination of both, okay? And that's just called an ecotone. And we have a lot of that in, if you will, close to the Columbia River. Badger Mountain, for example, is probably a good example of an ecotone. It's got a lot of shrub steppe, but it's also got trees sticking up in the sagebrush. And it's kind of interesting right now, a lot of those trees are starting to die in the past few years because of drought and what have you. So we got an ecotone. And then we move up into the dry forest, which was primarily dominated by ponderosa pine. Generally, they were very open stands, but for various reasons, they're starting to become less open and more dense. Then we move further up the forest towards the Cascades, and now we get into a mix of pine and Doug fir and true firs and a variety of different trees. So what I want to do as I go through here now, I want to talk about the different types of categories, if you will, of plants that are within our ecosystems, okay? Trees, shrubs, grasses, forbs. Forbs are just another name for flowers, if you will, broadleaf herbaceous plants, whether they be annuals or perennials. So I want to stop right there and see if we got any questions in the chat, or if anybody's got any questions, they can raise them now. Just take a little break. No questions?
I'm not seeing any yet. Everybody a second here, but yeah, put them in the chat if you have some.
We'll give it a minute.
Yep.
So I must be perfectly clear in my presentation. That's a bad assumption. Or if somebody's got something that I guess they could spout it out. If it just,
here we go. Could you show the forb list again?
Can I show the forb list again?
Yeah.
I'm going to go through forbs here real shortly.
Yep. More detail then. Yep. So I guess go ahead, Al.
Okay, we'll proceed. So, oops, gotta get this out of my way. Back. So here are some of the attributes of plants that are more adaptive to change than not. And what's kind of interesting is these are what's adapted to change is also very much, generally speaking, very fire resistant also. So, oops, I got the thing blocking my view, but that's okay. I can figure it out. You can read, but I'll go through a couple of those. But if you think about it, when plants are low growing, they're obviously close to the ground. They offer less opportunity for flames to get big. They have an open configuration, so the heat does not move back and forth. I use an example of a mitten versus a glove. Anybody ever notice the difference? If you're wearing mittens, your fingers stay a lot warmer, don't they? Because your fingers are close together. But if you're wearing gloves, your fingers are a lot further apart, and there's more surface area exposed around your finger, so they can get colder a lot faster. Does that make sense? So in a plant, the more open the plant is, the less likely it is to burn. And the same thing is very much true. It has an opportunity to get sunlight in and grow, generally speaking, much better. Moisture content of the plant is an important point. Succulent plants, if you think about a lot of the desert stuff, cactus, etc., have nice succulent plants and don't have to rely on reoccurring moisture. They can live for quite a while without a reoccurring rain and what have you. Water-like sap is in many of the hardwood trees, they have watery sap and not a sticky sap like in the pine trees and what have you. And they have a broad leaf, which is less surface to volume, okay? So less of the entire plant is showing. If you think about a pine needle, the amount of surface shown to the entire volume is much higher. So it dries out a lot easier than if you have something that is larger and more bulky in size. Herbaceous, yeah, okay. You can read the rest of those. Here's another thing that as far as fire resistant versus fire prone vegetation, short versus tall. It's not up in the wind. A short plant is not up in the wind catching lots of oxygen, if you will, to carry a fire, because a fire needs oxygen, fuel, and heat in order to burn. And so if you have less oxygen available for a short plant, it's not going to burn as much. Obviously, maybe not obviously, but herbaceous vegetation is much less flammable than woody vegetation. Deciduous versus evergreen. Yeah, I talked about the rest of those already. Now I want to get into the home ignition zone and the different areas within the home ignition zone. This home ignition zone concept was developed by a fellow at the Northern Fire Lab out of Missoula, Montana, a guy named Jack Cohen. What he did is he started some very large prescribed burns and created crown fires that came up towards what he had built some houses out in some cleared areas. And he built them at different distances from these crown fires. He ran these crown fires, raging forest fires at these structures. And what he found in his research that a wooden structure will not sustain combustion at a distance of greater than 100 feet. So if you have 100 feet of clearance, even the most hot forest fire will not cause the fire to burn by radiant heat, if you will. The radiation is, so you get 100-foot distance. Now, there's another thing that's very important that I need to discuss here also, is one of the prime reasons that houses catch on fire is they catch on fire from firebrands, embers, that floating embers that go up in the air and are carried by the hot air, and they land on a structure that is flammable. And if you think about it, the most flammable and exposed area of your home from the air is what? Your roof, right? And so if you have a class A or a clean roof, you're in very good shape, up in the upper 90% probability if you follow these directions and points that we're going to be talking about of your home surviving a wildland fire. So this zone, this home ignition zone is broke down into 3 different landscape zones. We got the area, can you see my cursor? Yeah, okay. So the area right around the home, landscape zone 1, is that 5-foot distance around the home. And we talk about this, but the objective there is to have no ignitions, nothing ignitable in here. In this landscape zone 2, our objective would be to have no spread. And out here, and this is 5 to 30 feet out in that distance there. So that's landscape zone 2. And then out here, we have landscape zone 3 surrounding the home, and that is from 30 to 100 feet out. So the idea there would be have low intensity. And we'll talk about the different types that we're going to do this. We're going to achieve this with different types of native vegetations. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Now we're going to get into talking about the different types of vegetation that we have. Okay, so here is what I just got done talking about, the 3 different landscape zones. Zone 1, that's 0 to 5 feet. Now I say 10 feet if you have a very flammable siding on the side of your house. Then you might want to go out to 10 feet. And the idea is have nothing that's burnable in there. Now that doesn't mean no vegetation. That means that we got a lot of herbaceous vegetation. And I'll talk about that here in a second. And then we get out to 5 to 30 feet. Our objective out there is no spread. So we got the vegetation spread out, pruned up, and no dead fuels in the area. And then we get out further, zone 3, which is the 30 to 100 feet. We got well-spaced wildland fuels, if you will, but the idea is that we got them pruned up high enough so that the fire cannot get up into the tops, the crowns of those trees. And so you see what we're doing is we're creating, if you will, can you see my arm okay? High intensity fire way out here. And as we get closer to the house, the intensity and spread go down to almost 0, okay? That's the objective, so that we're gradually reducing the flammability, the danger from a fire. So here's the categories of vegetation that best fit in those different zones. And we'll talk about specifics here in a minute. But landscape zone 1, we want ground cover, herbaceous forbs, if you will, annuals and perennials, herbaceous vines, and short grasses. Those are the types of things as far as vegetation is concerned. There's other things that we can do. We can put non-flammable rock around there, concrete, or whatever we want to do. But we're not talking about making your landscape ugly. We're talking about making your landscape beautiful. One of the things about forbs is forbs have a high moisture content even when they're uh, starting to dry out. They have a moisture content of anywhere from 450% to around 250%. That means that the weight of the water in there is 4.5 times higher than the weight of the vegetation. So when a lot of pretty flowers dry up, there is very little to no vegetative material left. If you ever notice when flowers wilt out and die down, they lay flat on the ground and there's very little vegetative material there. Forbs carry a lot of moisture content, so they are outstanding plants to have around close to your home. So again, we don't want, our objective there is having nothing that burns. So we don't want trees and shrubs. We don't want organic mulches. We don't want bark or wood chips around a home. We want low flammability plants. That's what I was talking about, and we'll get into that here. And inorganic mulches, for example, scoria, red cinders are there's lots of different colors of cinders. They come in a lot of colors, but we can put rocks around the home, have plants planted, spaced throughout, and make it look beautiful. So those are the types of things we want close to the house so that we're managing the ignition there, that we don't want things to burn in that area. So again, we're talking about this is just the same attributes that I talked about earlier, low growing and this whole thing. So we don't need to discuss that again, but I just wanted to show that's the type of stuff we want close to the house. So in nature, we got forbs. They're the plants that normally grow out in the shrub steppe and up in the forest. They fill the niche in between lots of different things. And so we get a lot of beneficial insects, birds, and various types of critters that are good. Eat those for foods, and humans have used those for food for years, as well as medicines, okay? So here's some examples that I want to talk about is that make for good vegetation close to the home, And now this is just the limited stuff, but I think, Mel has talked about these, and so has Betsy and Don talked about some of the same plants, but these are the ones that are great for close to the home in that landscape zone 1 where we don't want things to burn. Columbine, strawberries strawberries make a great vegetative material. In fact, I've seen people have basically lawns made out of strawberry. They don't do well with a lot of foot traffic, as I'm sure you're aware, but they do make an interesting a lawn, and I've seen them planted, and they're really, really pretty. Here's a couple of plants. Yarrow, a very, very adaptive plant. It tells you lots of things about the soil, and I won't get into that too much, but it tells you if the soil is increasing or decreasing in its health, just by the abundance and the which way, if yarrow is increasing or decreasing in the area. Phlox is another one that's just a beautiful plant to have around. Clarkia and fireweed, both of these are nice, pretty plants. Fireweed is a great nitrogen fixer. It comes in following disturbances, and it's a great plant. So anyway, I'm just showing you some examples of forbs that work well. Bitterroot is just an absolutely beautiful plant that comes up early. Scarlet gilly is one that I've seen that stay in bloom for almost the whole summer with just a tad bit of water helping it out just a little bit. So anyway, those are some examples of forbs that I think are great to have in that zone 1. And by the way, when I say when they can be in zone 1, they can also, once they're in zone 1, you can have them in zone 1 or 2 and 3 as well. Anything close to the house, you can plant anywhere near the house. So I want to go back and just reinforce again, this is that area, that landscape zone 1, nice and close to the house. And the idea there, we have objectives for each one of these. No ignitions, no spread, and I'll get into that here in a second. So, any questions so far on that?
Yeah, so Audrey asked, when it comes to trees with low leaf litter, how do you balance that with the amount of water in the area? For example, oak species leave a ton of vegetation, but maintain that leaf litter.
Okay, try that again. I'm not sure I
Yeah.
understood.
So Audrey, you want to unmute and clarify your question?
Hi, sorry. This is actually Leah. I'm Audrey's
Oh,
child.
okay.
So I was just thinking, for instance, with oak species, I live in the Bay Area, but my mom lives up here. With oak species, they like pull up a tremendous amount of water from the water table, and they like share that water with like nearby plants, so they increase the amount of moisture in that local area. And then, but the flip side of that for like fire safety is, of course, that they maintain a lot of leaf litter, and that leaf litter, right, is like fertilizer and also helps retain the moisture. So how do you balance that?
Okay. Good. That's a good question. Is first of all, oaks are outstanding fire resistant species. Okay. Now, dry leaves are not a good fire resistant attribute. So my recommendation on something like that would be rake the leaves up in the spring, just as this starts to dry out. Okay, and you're getting new leaf bud coming out about the same time. So it's before fire season. And so now you're just doing maintenance, raking up the leaves, which will become a fire hazard, right? Not a terrible fire hazard, but they allow spread. They're not going to burn real hot, but they allow the fire to spread. And if they're anywhere near the house, that's a problem. So, but the trees, oak trees, will almost, never say always or never say never, but generally speaking, oak are an outstanding attribute to have around a home. Does that answer that?
Yeah, thank you so much.
You bet. Anything else?
Yeah, so Debbie's asking, is a hardy geranium a forb?
Yes, a geranium is a forb. A forb is just another name for a flower, okay? A broadleaf herbaceous plant. Okay?
And what were the names of the first two plants before the strawberries and columbines?
A penstemon, and I forgot what the other one was.
Lupin.
Lupin. Thank you.
Thanks.
Is those are both, as far as penstemon, there are multiple different species and varieties of penstemon that do well. And the same thing is true with lupin, but the wild lupin around here does great. And they come in about 3 different colors: yellow, purple, and white. I've seen around here. So you can have
Hey, Al.
Betsy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question / comment. So it refers to primarily new construction, but also like downtown where I live, where the yards are really small. So
Yeah.
my comment is that most of the yards barely get into the zone 2. And like a friend of mine I know is on this talk, and their new house has in the new neighborhoods, tiny yards. What is your best recommendation as far as, planting small trees and shrubs in a limited space? Because I know how I approach it, but
yeah, well, we'll get into
your...
shrubs here in a minute. We'll get into shrubs that are pretty good. And I agree with you that a lot of in-town homes don't have 100 feet. That when they get out to 30 feet, that's pretty good. Now, probably one of the key things that needs to happen in a subdivision, if you will, when one house starts on fire, then we got some serious problems because from a wildland fire standpoint, now it's starting to take a lot of resources. And So what the thing that I think is important is to work with the neighborhood and try to get everybody doing something. That's never going to work 100%. It's never going to be perfect, but it can be excellent, if you will. You do the best you can with the time and the energy that you have, and trying to get people to do things. There's a lot of resources available locally. Is the fire department, the Wenatchee Valley Fire Department has a person that does that as a full-time job. And obviously Cascadia can do some of that also. And there's lots of things. Master gardeners can do some work. So there's resources around that can help get neighborhood things going. Okay. And I'll talk more, Betsy, I'll talk more about the shrubs here in a minute when I get down to shrubs. Any other questions, Kurt?
Not at this point, so yeah.
Okay, we'll go ahead.
Back.
Well, in fact, here we'll get into shrubs. Is now we're into landscape zone 2, which is that area 5 to 30 feet from the home. Or when I say home, the structure, how's that? And so, we want native grasses, shrubs, and small deciduous trees. We want the area to be spaced out. We want the area between vegetation, and I'll get into that here in a second. So we want the area lean, clean, and green. That's the easiest thing to remember in that 5 to 30 feet from the home. Lean, clean, and green. Lean, we don't want it overdone with vegetation. We don't want dead material there, so we want it clean. And we want it green during the fire season, okay? So if you can achieve those 3 things, lean, clean, and green during the fire season, that's a pretty good deal, okay? So we want to be looking, the objective here is to not have fire spread. If an ember comes into that area, in that landscape zone 2, and catches something on fire, we don't want the fire to last long enough and to be hot enough that it'll catch something else, a neighbor, if you will, a neighboring piece of vegetation on fire, okay? So we want to look at single trees and pruned up 10 feet, or at least a third of the tree, depending on the height of the tree. And we want those to be about 10 feet apart, trees. And we want single shrubs that are well groomed. And we want the dead material taken out of those. So just like and no continuous ground fuels. That is, we don't want dry, dead stuff laying on the ground so that the fire cannot move. There's 2 ways a fire can do damage: intensity and spread, okay? And that's what we're doing. We're managing spread here in this zone, landscape zone 2, and in landscape zone 3 coming up, that's where we manage the intensity, okay? So now let's talk a little about some of the grasses, the native grasses. Root systems are probably one of the key things with grasses. Some of our roots go way back, but some of our grass roots go way deep. And they go down as deep as 6 feet into the ground. It's amazing how deep some of the grass species will send their roots down. And so most of them are xeric. They don't require a lot of water, but a little bit of water here and there can keep them green throughout the fire season. And a lot of them, are bunch grasses. So we'll talk about a couple of them. This is my favorite grass right here, Sandberg's bluegrass. It's a small grass. It only gets about 8 inches tall. It's a unique species. It doesn't waste its time producing seed heads unless it's a little bit stressed. If you go out and look in natural environments and everything's hunky-dory, that is, it's running smooth, you'll see the Sandberg's bluegrass, very few of the plants have seed heads on them. But if you burn it or graze it or do something to it, you come back the next year, you'll see all these seed heads everywhere. And it's just absolutely kind of amazing. It's a really neat plant. It's so short that it doesn't produce much of a flame length either. Now another one is Idaho fescue. And it's a fine grass. Now this one's not very well pruned or groomed, I should say. But it's another fine grass. It's easy to keep both of these grasses pretty much green throughout the entire fire season by just giving them water once a week or every other week. And they'll stay green for a long time. Here's another couple of grasses. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures of these when they're green, but needle and thread grass and Indian rice grass. Indian rice grass is one grass that really grows well in sandy soil. It's a really drought hardy species. Both of these are, as a matter of fact. The needle and thread is also, but they do well in sandy, drouthy conditions. Sand drop seed and prairie June grass are another couple of grasses that are nice and good in water resistant. Water, not requiring a lot of water, xeric, if you will. Okay, now here's the two grasses that are probably the most common. Blue bunch wheatgrass is probably the most common grass, bunch grass, in the Columbia Basin, and it's the native that was here predominantly. And again, it just adding a little water to it here and there will keep it green throughout the season. Over here on the other side is basin wild rye. Now that's a big grass that can get up to, it can get as tall as 4 or 5, even up to 6 feet in some cases. It's a very large grass. It was very important to the Native Americans around here, as it provides, if you notice the seed heads up on top here, these provided a lot of food for the Native Americans. It was a very common and very useful grass. Then the last two grasses I'm going to talk about are a little bit more, the pine grass is a species that's more up in the dry forest into the mixed conifer forest. So if you tried to plant that down here in the sage steppe, it would be not at all a xeric species. It would be kind of a water hog species. And then the sedges are more of the upper elevations in the more mesic areas of our environment. But there's probably, I don't know, 25, 30 different species of sedge that grow around here. By the way, one of my friends was a researcher, and every time he got in trouble, his figuring out the species of a sedge is a very challenging task. Every time he got in trouble, his boss would have him go out and figure out what kind of species of sedge were out there. That was his punishment. So let's talk about shrubs. There is a great variety of shrubs. Most of them are very xeric. They're a great food source for both us and wildlife, and they provide some of them provide good shade and cover. The first two that I'm going to talk about, serviceberry and woods rose, are probably two of the hardiest ones around here. Woods rose will grow just about anywhere. In fact, I have some growing in my driveway down at the bottom where my driveway hits the road. They are hardy, and they put out a nice network of roots, and at times they can be absolutely gorgeous. And they don't take much water at all, just a little bit here and there, and they will do fine. Serviceberry is another really interesting species. A way to identify it, if you look at the margin, the edge of the leaf of serviceberry, about 3/4 of the way down, that serration stops, and then the margin becomes whole, if you will. So it's smooth down here at the base, and it's serrated about 3/4 of the way up. And pretty neat. That's an easy way to identify. It blooms early in the spring, and it's got beautiful flowers. Okay, and they need a little cleanup. Everything needs a little cleanup here and there. Okay, another couple of species, elderberry, is a great wildlife food as well as I know a number of people that make wine out of that. And then golden currant, another good species for critters. Here's a pretty one. Spirea is a very pretty species. It's a nice open grown type of plant, and you can prune this, and the stems coming up, called the canes, if you will. You can prune out the bigger ones and let the smaller ones kind of move out more, so you get more coverage with it. And one over here, shrubby cinquefoil, not necessarily my favorite, and but it's an interesting plant. Deer don't like it, and very few animals, butterflies love it. So it's a good pollinator plant. In some climates, it can be an evergreen, but around here, it's frequently a deciduous. Here's a couple of neat plants that I like. Is kinnikinick is a low growing. It only gets maybe 4 to 6 inches at most off the ground. It's pretty much an evergreen species. It's really a nice ground cover. And on the other side over here is Oregon grape. We have two species of Oregon grapes in this area. The one that I'm more fond of is the short Oregon grape. We have one that gets up to 3 feet tall. I don't know the exact name for it, but it's let's see, it's aquifolium is the species name on it. I can remember that. And Rubens is the species that I particularly care for. It only gets about 1 foot to 18 inches tall. So there's 2 different species of that. And this is the shorter species that I had here. 2 more. This is one of my favorite. Mock orange is really a nice, pretty plant. And it puts off some beautiful flowers. And it's not chewed on a lot by deer. Not, everything is chewed on by deer at the certain time of the year. Now over here on the other side, dogwood, that's ice cream and candy to deer. They love this plant here. And this one is probably the most mesic, water loving of all the shrubs that I've shown. But yet it'll do well in a deep soil. It'll do well, and it doesn't require a lot of moisture, but it does require some. This here does very well. The mock orange does very well in a droughty condition. And all of these are great in landscape zone 2, that 5 to 30 feet from the home. So, and you just keep them spread out. Okay, here's the thing that with shrubs, when you have a shrub, what you want to do is keep it, if just say your shrub is 2 feet tall, you double that distance. That's how far apart you want to keep them so that the one will not catch another one on fire. There's not enough radiant energy, if you will, for this plant if it caught on fire, something landed here and caught it on fire, there's not enough radiant energy to catch the next plant on fire. That's on flat ground. And as you can see, as we increase the slope from 20 to 40, we want to increase that distance, and we get steep slopes, we want to increase it more. Same thing is true with trees. We got to keep them about 10 feet apart. These are mostly conifer types that we're talking about. And then as the slope gets steeper, we want to increase that distance. So again, the radiant heat and the convective heat will not catch the next plant on fire. So maybe we'll stop there. Did I answer your question, Betsy?
Yes, mostly. And I did have a comment on something, because you're focusing on the, adapted and xeric nature. But what I've noticed in people's landscapes, especially people with irrigation rights, is that they overwater their kinnikinick and their Oregon grape. And, they complain that kinnikinick is not really a ground cover because it's 1 foot high, and that's just too much water. And then Oregon grape, I have a friend, and I swear theirs is 6 or 7 feet high, the tall Oregon grape. And that again is just historically too much water.
Yeah, that's the aquifolium. And again, I can't remember what the Oregon grape, the short one, it's I forgot the Latin name right now.
It might be procumbens.
Okay, it is.
Procumbens, yeah.
It's a short one. It's only about 12 to 18 inches tall. And it's really a nice little plant. It's very drought resistant. The other thing about where the natural habitat for the kinnikinick is it very much in a dry forest. That's where it is most common. And so it does not require a lot of moisture at all. It does very well. In fact, I think it would be pretty darn hard to underwater that. So it doesn't take much water at all. Any other questions there, Kirk?
Not yet. So aloe on kinnikinick, if you don't water it much, is it very flammable? Would it be okay close to the house?
No, it's okay close to the house. but I would water it to keep it healthy. Okay. And it will only get 4 to 6 inches off the ground if you manage it properly. And by the way, after a while, when they start getting the mat, you can lift those up and rake out the dead dead leaves from underneath it. And so it's easy to keep clean.
Hey, Al, it is 7:58, so I know you have more, so, and keep going, so folks, we're almost to that 8 o'clock time, but Al said he'll go till he's done, so you're welcome to stick around, or if you have to go, that's certainly understandable. So,
Yeah, I understand that very much. Is you're welcome to check out anytime you want. But I probably have maybe 10 minutes left, something like that.
And we'll have this recording on the Cascadia website, and Kirk will send it out as well. So if you do need to jump off, you'll be able to hear the rest of it at your convenience.
Okay, is there any other questions, or should we move
not
on?
yet. No,
Okay,
sorry,
we'll
yeah.
move on. Okay, now we're getting into landscape zone 3, and this is that area 30 to 100 feet from the home. If you live out in the country, this is very common to have, but if you're in the city, you may not have this landscape around your home. But anyway, this is where it's safe to put in larger trees. When I say larger trees, you don't want to be planting big trees close to your house because of wind throw and what have you, just from a safety standpoint as well as a fire resistance standpoint. So the larger adaptive shrubs and the native grasses are just great out in this area. So, and out in there, the objective is to reduce the fire intensity. Like I was telling you, the research project that was done on this home ignition zone, they had a big crown fire, like 300-foot flame lengths that came rushing at this area. And as soon as it hit this area, it dropped to the ground. And I mean, it scorched a few trees and burned a few trees, but it dropped to the ground. So the intensity was low. And so if you keep the trees well spaced, and I say no ladder fuels. Ladder fuels are those fuels that are underneath flammable fuels that are underneath something else that's flammable. For example, if you had a sagebrush underneath a pine tree, a ponderosa pine, the sagebrush would be a ladder fuel. So you want to take that out from underneath the pine. Then the shrubs are cared for and clean. Again, you want to remove a lot of the dead fuels. Surface and ground fuels, either low density or discontinuous. And prune the trees up about 10 feet so that fire cannot get into the crown. So now we're going to talk about some trees, native trees, root systems. Root systems of these trees are both, I'll talk about them as we go through them. A number of them are very xeric, but the first two I'm going to be talking about are not xeric. Okay, we got an aspen. Now this is, you either love it or hate it, is aspen trees. And the same thing with cottonwood. You love them or hate them. You see the seeds here, the cotton's blowing around, and many people dislike those very much. But that's, these are, they both belong to the same genus. Populus is the species, or genus, excuse me. And they can be pretty trees, but they require a little bit more water. Aspen, the way you manage aspen is the root system. As I mentioned, it's a fire dependent species, but it's not at all fire resistant or resilient, I should say. And because these burn very easy, and the cambium, the green stuff, is right in the cambium. The chlorophyll, I should say, is right in the cambium. It's probably less than 1/8 of an inch deep, and so you can scratch your name onto those, and it takes just very little heat to kill these. But the root system, once the soil warms up, these will reproduce very rapidly. They're all the aspen are tied together in one root system, and it sprouts extremely rapidly. Excuse me. So it sprouts extremely readily, and also these can become a pest if you don't want these in your yard. They will move around. Couple of trees that are not well known around here, but netleaf hackberry used to be a little bit more common around here. It's pretty well gone as far as a native species anymore. But it's a cool tree. A lot of birds and insects love this tree. It's a unique tree. It doesn't get very big at all. And it's a nice hardy tree. All the birds and lots of critters love it. Same thing with Pacific willow. It's a tree that requires a little bit more water, but they do well with just a good deep soil. Oregon Valley oak is a tree that was a little bit more common around here, but it's pretty well disappeared. It doesn't get much further north right now than Ellensburg, but it's a tree that is really drought hardy and can grow just about anywhere on some pretty poor soils. Somewhat the opposite of this tree over here, a big leaf maple. I've seen it down in the very lower reaches of Number One Canyon in Wenatchee. So it'll grow on maybe a north aspect or with a little help with some water in the Wenatchee area. They're native to the area, and I've seen them down in almost to the city limits. I think most of us know about ponderosa pine. It's a species that is very fire resistant. In fact, the reason I just threw that in here, because it's very common, and I can understand having these out in zone 3, just keep them pruned up and well maintained. Ponderosa pine is a very fire resistant and resilient species. What it does, it totally fire adapted. The reason I put this nose cone up here, the space capsule up here, do you remember these back in the 70s and 80s and 90s when they were still using that? Well, as this came back into Earth's orbit, it heated up, and that's what this is doing here. And when it heated up, it spit off. It was a laminated metal, and it spit off the metal. It flaked it out all the time as it's coming back in, and you see the flakes going off, the red hot flakes. Well, they got that idea from a ponderosa pine, because as you heat the bark of a ponderosa pine, it flicks off the bark. It dissipates the heat. And so it's used to low intensity fires, and it just dissipates the heat very, very rapidly, just like, and they got the idea for the entry capsules from the pine. I think that's pretty cool. So rocket science from a pine tree. Okay, kind of summarizing here, the landscape zone ones, we want to use ground covers, herbaceous perennial and annuals, herbaceous vines, and turf grasses are kind of nice in there if you're so inclined, or any of those forbs that I had talked about. Zones 2 and 3, shrubs, trees, and larger native and adaptive grasses. But anything can go into zones 2 and 3 that we've talked about. So here it is again. The objective out here in zone 3 is low intensity. Landscape zone 2, we want to stop a fire from spreading. And in zone 1, we don't want anything to burn. If done properly, your home has over a 90% chance of surviving even the worst fires, okay? But let me tell you one interesting fact that's kind of interesting. In a study done by a fella down in the California area, just by cleaning up this area, this landscape zone 1, you increase the probability of surviving your home by up to 80%, just by doing this area right around the immediate home. Now, that's also assuming you keep your roof clean and your gutters clean, so you don't want the home to burn, catching on fire, but the vegetation generally is some of the things that catch the house on fire. Last thing I think I'm covering here is maintenance. No landscape is maintenance free, but one of the things, I'm not going to go through all of these, one of the things that I think we can do that we rarely do is just take your garden hose with a nozzle and spray the stuff out of it. We can't make a plant fire resistant just by spraying it and getting the dead needles out of it, but we can sure increase or decrease the probability of ignition by washing it out and doing these other things. And the other thing I was going to say about the differences in organic mulch and inorganic mulch near a structure, it's okay to have organic mulch as long as you're out there in zone 2 and 3. But you get near the house, don't use organic, use inorganic mulches, okay? Another thing is I've seen this in Wenatchee, as a matter of fact, where people do a good job of cleaning up their yard, and then they take the debris and throw it on the downhill side out in the sagebrush. And so they put a bunch of fuel down below their house and think, well, I got rid of it. Don't do that. Dispose of your waste properly. Okay. Okay, now this the native plants. They're good hardy plants. They will withstand, I believe our native plants will withstand our climate change much more readily than those of the non-native variety. Most of them are xeric. They're fire adapted. They're generally much lower maintenance than the brought in non-native plants. And they provide habitat for beneficial insects and critters. And it's not the pests that we often think about that come in from the non-native species, but these are generally beneficial insects. They're in harmony with the local environment, so they can withstand that range of variability that I was talking about, those extremes. And you can get them locally here. So they're absolutely readily available. And so with that, I just one more time, the 3 landscape zones that I talked about, and I'm hoping I'm driving this point home that you understand what the objective of those 3 zones are. Very easy. And so now I hope we have connected some of the dots, and so that's basically the end of what I was talking about. Here are some resources that you can use, and Kurt will be sending this out, so you'll have this stuff. So, are there any questions? I went 1 minute longer than I thought I was.
So yeah, I have several questions. So
Okay, good.
I guess it's Barb. What are your thoughts on having an uncut meadow of native plants, grasses, forbs in zones 2 and 3? And a follow-up, Brett asked a follow-up on that about having has a lot of basin wild rye on their property that's 18, 24 inches tall, and it dries out in the summer. How much of a fire hazard is that?
Okay, first of all, in the uncut grass in landscape zone 2 defeats the objective of landscape zone 2, because you're going to have spread in those grasses. In zone 3, if it's trimmed down, I don't know what the objective would be of was that native vegetation, did you say?
Yeah, what are your thoughts on having an uncut meadow of native plants, grasses and forbs in zones 2 and 3? So,
yeah, I don't
they're just growing, at uncut.
In zone 2, that's not a good idea. Is because, like I say, the objective there in zone 2 is to slow the rate of spread down so you don't have spread. Now, as you get into July and what have you, as things start to cure out, you go out there with a weed whacker and cut them down to about 4 inches, if you will. That's not going to hurt the root system, and it's not going to hurt the base of the plant at all. Out in zone 3, it depends how thick that is. If it's really thick, I'd be nervous. If it is, one can look at it and determine whether it's a fire hazard or not. If you have a continuous heavy grass, it is probably a fire hazard, and you probably don't want to leave that unmanaged. Okay. Again, you can weed whack that and move some of that stuff after they've cured out and started to dry out. Or the alternative to that would be to put some water on them, a little bit of water every week or 2 to keep that stuff green throughout most of the fire season. Did I answer all of that?
Well, yeah, Barb and Brett, if you have any want to follow up on that, feel free to unmute, jump in there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Brett said the wild rye would all be in zone 3, but I think you kind of answered that.
Yeah, well, that's another thing is that's one of my favorite plants, basin wild rye, and you can cut that down in the spring, and cut it down to it's about 6 inches tall, and that way you get rid of most of the material that's hanging out, and you get a fresh start every year. And you're not hurting the plant because by definition is a perennial, all above ground material pretty much dies annually.
And yeah, Brett said you answered his question, so.
Okay, great.
So, and Debbie's wondering what is a good mulch to help plants in zone 1?
My favorite, like I say, is cinders. Okay, they do about 5 things. They do a slow fertilizer because they're volcanic material, and so they do release some nutrients to the soil. I mean, they're not quick release nutrients. They don't add nitrogen to the soil instantly by any means, but over time they do. They're non-flammable. They don't blow away. The cats don't use them all the time, and you don't have to replace them hardly ever. You can just get a light blower and blow the stuff off of them. Another thing that many people try to put down a not a hardware cloth, excuse me, a geotextile fabric down, plastic or whatever, and then put the material, the mulch on top of that's not a good idea. The plastic will start to show up in very short period of time, a year or two. The dust and seeds will land on top of that, of weeds, if you will, and so they'll be growing on top, and then you just end up with a mess. The other thing is when you put something down that prevents the carbon dioxide exchange between the air and the soil, you really decrease the health of the soil. So the fabric is not a good idea.
And Kim wants some clarification about what do you mean by cinders?
Okay, it's a rock. It's a rock with it's volcanic material. The technical name for it is scoria. It's they're either generally black, gray, or kind of a reddish orange color is what they come in, and they are the product of a part of a volcanic system where they blow out material, and generally it passes through a little bit of water, so it rusts. That's why it's orange at times, and it's just there's metal content in it, and so it just rusts. That's why it's kind of it's very lightweight material. It almost floats. It's not pumice. Pumice is a material that actually is the ash and what have you that comes out of a volcano. This is actually magma that is mixed with a lot of carbon dioxide, and so it's a lot of air. It's about 50% air and 50% holes, I should say, and 50% solid material. So it's very lightweight. Anything else?
Kim asked if most nurseries carry it.
Yeah, you can get it. You can get that all over the place. You can get it at the place right behind Hobby Lobby. I forgot that guy's name, but you can get it at Lowe's, Home Depot, any place you can pick it up.
I think they usually sell it in like bags.
Yeah, they sell it in bags, but you can buy it wholesale in large quantities at God, I can't think of that guy's name, but there's a place right behind Hobby Lobby, and then also there's Bob's Apple Barrel over in the Wenatchee side. You can get it.
Jay's behind Hobby Lobby.
Yeah, Jay's. Yeah, I couldn't remember the name of it. But those two places you can get it in large quantities. Anything else?
That's all at this point. So thank you everybody for joining us, and Al, thank you again for giving your presentation.
You
Kurt,
bet.
I just put something in the chat that you can see demonstrate or see different types of mulch out at the Master Gardener Community Education Garden.
Yeah, thanks.
On Western and Stillwater is the Master Gardeners Community Education Garden, and there are several examples of different mulches out there that you can look at.
Spring water.
Yeah. Okay, that was close. Still water, spring water. Yes. Well, I appreciate everybody listening, and I thank you very much. And I guess we can stop sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good
Thanks.
evening.
Thanks again.